everybody, to the Pocho podcast. This is episode 12, and I am here with a special guest, Walter Franco. How's it going, Walter? Good to have you on.
Good, Beto. How's it going on your end? Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, it's going pretty good. No problem. I don't think a lot of people know, but we did this interview or podcast a few weeks ago. But on my end, I messed up the audio pretty badly. I tried to recover, but it wasn't recoverable. So we're doing it over again. But yeah, glad to have you on. Uh, I've listened to. I guess you've been on another podcast. What's this called? The Colorful Kit, talking some business, and
Right.
yeah, I listened to a little bit of that and some other of your tweets and stuff. So it's been some interesting. Actually, so like I was mentioning earlier, conversation or Twitter conversation back and forth with Martin de Palacio, who
hmm
I mean, of all the journalists, I don't know like what your history is with Martin and like the whole community, but I've known him for like a long time, even before like Twitter, like in the forum,
Oh, really?
in the forum days, the big soccer
Oh,
forum
okay.
days, or I don't think Univision days, but I don't know if you remember like the Univision forums, but the but he's always been like I don't agree with everything he says, but he's always been like a
hmm
pretty legitimate source of information.
Yeah, he's pretty. Yeah, I would say he's definitely informed on both sides of the border. I think he grew up. I don't know if he's from Tijuana. I've never asked him. My interactions with him have been limited and actually really mostly recent over the last few months. More so just over the last few days with the whole Rodolfo Pizarro and just the comparisons between LigaMX and MLS. But um, I know he's from Mexico. I'm assuming from Tijuana because I think it even says on his profile or something. But he's done a lot of work in Mexico with Medio Tiempo. I think right now he's doing work for NFL in Spanish. I think he was hired by West Ham United to do kind of their Spanish language content when they signed Chicharito, and so he definitely has been out there and has been in a prominent space in the social media and journalistic side. He seems to have a good pulse on things that are happening on both sides of the border and globally as it pertains to Mexicans. So he's a good follow. Yeah, I agree. I don't always agree with everything that he says, but you know, I've enjoyed interacting with him because he has some interesting points of view, and he's at least willing to listen to other points of view too. He doesn't immediately shut other people's opinions down.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. But I guess to start off this, let's I guess talk a little bit about your, I guess, growing up as a Mexican American or Mexican or however you want to call it. Like, what was your influence as far as Mexican culture growing up? I guess with parents and family or uncles and aunts and Spanish speaking or no, or soccer fans or no, and how did you get into all this Mexican soccer and I guess your life? How was the main
So I
influences?
yeah, so I was born in San Diego, but really it was more just my mom uh, crossing the border. Back then it was a lot easier in the 80s to do this, but she was living in Tijuana, came across San Diego to the hospital that I was going to be born at, was born. Then we went, I think, whatever, 2 days later, 3 days later, we went back to Tijuana where I ended up, living for the first 3, 4 years of my life. And then from there, eventually moved back to San Diego, or moved to San Diego where I then lived there for until I was, I think, nine-ish. And then from there, moved to Nevada, then eventually to Utah, where I went to high school. Did my undergrad here, went back to grad school at San Diego State to get my sports MBA, and also lived for a few years in Florida and Georgia. So I've kind of lived a little bit of everywhere, but Mexican culture has always been a strong part of my upbringing. I only spoke Spanish in the home. My mom wouldn't give me any other option. Um, and to this day, 98% of my family still lives in Mexico, and so across the border from San Diego and those border towns, and so um, you know speaking Spanish has been a part of my life every day, and communicating with them. We go often back there to see my family with my wife and my kids, and so it's still very much part of my life. My wife also similarly was born in California, but she was actually raised in El Paso. But like her, we only spoke Spanish in the home, and so that's something that we're trying to do the same with our three daughters as we've been raising them. We more me than my wife. My wife kind of does some more Spanglish with our daughters, but I'm strictly Spanish. Only speak Spanish to my daughters, um, and with the idea that culturally we're very much still Mexican.
Yeah, yeah. That's interesting as they grow, uh, to sort of analyze the capabilities that they have to just speak both. They learned
Yeah,
English
and
from their
they're
friends, and at home it's Spanish, and yeah, it's pretty interesting.
exactly, and they're the two oldest who are old enough are in bilingual or dual immersion programs, Spanish and English at their elementary schools, and so we insisted on that because we grew up speaking Spanish, but we didn't learn, we didn't go we didn't learn the grammar rules and conjugation and all that. We just kind of just learned it on the fly without actually any formal learning, and so that's why we wanted them to learn that because they wouldn't learn it from us, and so that was an important thing for us.
Yeah, yeah, that's cool. So how did soccer influence your life growing up? Where did that come from?
I mean, I mean, obviously, back then when I was growing up, it wasn't so much at the LigaMX level because growing up on the border in Tijuana, there was no LigaMX club there. It wasn't obviously until the late 2000s where when Tijuana came around. But so from the club level, not really, but from the national team, of course. I mean, you
Yeah,
know, the big awakening for me was the '94 World Cup because, of course, Mexico didn't participate in the 1990 World Cups, and so '94 was one that really caught me. And then '98, being a little bit older, being I think I was 12 at the time, when it really just 100% sucked me in. I actually grew up growing up at that point in San Diego. Now, actually, NFL football was my uh, real first passion in the NBA, which I started watching a lot because it was just easily accessible. It was a little bit different trying to access soccer, but you knew when the World Cup hit and World Cup qualifiers that those are things that you watched. So soccer has always been, um, I guess in my blood, you could say, but um, it wasn't a priority at that time because the other sports were more in my face from a television standpoint, from interactions at school with people that weren't necessarily, even though probably my school is at least half or more were, either Mexican or of Mexican descent. But at that point, it's just what they're watching on TV. They're watching the NBA or they're watching the NFL, and so. But in my upbringing, sports has always been a part of my life. So I've always been a big sports fan, no matter what type of sport. So I've followed them all as much as I could.
yeah, yeah, same thing. Not to get into my whole history, but sort of the opposite of yours, as far as growing up and everything. But NFL was definitely one of the things. In one of our internal chats, we sort of rib on each other for like crying after losses, like the San Francisco 49ers loss.
Yeah.
One of the guys was a fan. I remember the Denver Broncos when they lost. I think they lost two in a row. I was a fan of the Denver Broncos and
Hmm.
John Elway and those three. I forget the name of the three uh, wide receivers they had that were really good.
Ed
And
McCaffrey. You're talking about the Broncos, right? Ed
yeah,
McCaffrey, and then
they had a name for
I
him,
already
didn't
forgot to.
they? Had a name
Easy
for him.
Ed McCaffrey.
Yeah, I think. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
I,
so I
I
remember
already
I remember
forgot the other
tearing
name
up
too.
after
It's been
that.
a while.
Yeah, I was after
Yeah.
their loss. I was like, a little kid crying. And then, but that was the last time that ever happened. I've grown like the Chivas fans. Uh, I've grown I've grown hardened by the failures, so now nothing affects me. But yeah, so that's
Sure.
yeah, soccer influence. So one thing I guess to transition into the I guess similar the similar, I guess, message of Mexican culture and everything for me was when I living in Mexico for a bit, just identifying with the soccer culture, the overall Mexican culture, and then coming to the United States and contrasting that, especially on social media or message boards, and seeing the United States national team fans, especially during, for me, an influential years were the 2002 World Cup, I guess pre and post like action and interaction with fans from
Hmm.
the United States and from Mexico, which caused a real like Mexic for me. My view was like a Mexican pride for LigaMX for the Mexican national team, and then the opposition, which were few. For U.S. soccer not being huge in the United States, uh,
Hmm.
but was still present. So going into this whole like present day MLS versus Liga MX, I know we every a lot of MLS fans are sort of reveling in the exporting of Mexican players to the MLS. What do you see for the future of that, or the impact of that on both leagues, I guess?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's really going to be an interesting season. I think, well, I mean, from multiple angles, right? I mean, you have Chicharito. I don't think he'll struggle. I mean, he's going to be starting every single game. He already has a captain's armband,
Yeah.
and so I don't think he's going to have the same success as Zlatan, for example, from a
Hmm.
goal scoring standpoint. But I think Chicharito is definitely more of a team player, and I think that'll definitely help Chicharito, or excuse me, the Galaxy in terms of playing better as a team, which will hopefully for them will result in better results and a deeper run in the playoffs. Pulido, I kind of feel bad for him because, when Pulido came, he was kind of the big signing for of a Mexican in MLS, and he was quickly overshadowed by Chicharito a few weeks later. And then now with Pizarro, so it's kind of like in terms of impact for Mexicans, Chicharito number one, then a distant second Pizarro, and then a very distant third Pulido. And so I don't know if he, you know, just looking at his social media, he looks like maybe he very much is into attention and publicity and fame and all that. And so, for him being quickly overshadowed, no one's really talking about him anymore. Um, and him playing in a smaller market like Kansas City that really doesn't make any
Yeah.
waves nationally from the MLS standpoint. I think there's definitely going to be a lot of talking points, but I think the main one that I'm looking at is, in terms of Pizarro being under this microscope, if he does reach his goal of getting to Europe after 2 or 3 years, which I think is going to be personally, from my perspective, I think it's going to be very tough. He's going to be 27, 28, 29. Um, if if things work out, he's going to take a pay cut. No one's going to pay him what he's going to what he's going to be making in Miami in Europe. Um, and so it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But if he does make that jump, is there going to be a domino effect with Mexican soccer players that are maybe 18, 19 in Liga MX and say, you know what, I what if I go right now to MLS? Maybe I take a pay cut, or maybe I get paid a little bit more, but I'm going to be more visible in terms of Europe, perhaps just because of distribution. MLS is available in more countries than Liga MX is, and so maybe more people will get a chance to watch me, and I'll make that jump. I'll be able to have a better lifestyle in the US. It's an up and coming league, and if that starts to happen, um, you know, as we've talked about before, Liga MX is already behind from the commercial and marketing standpoint. But if more Mexican players in their prime or pre-prime start coming to the U.S. and start to develop there, and really embrace the like the identity of MLS is starting to identify themselves as a selling league. Um,
Hmm.
and if you start seeing more of that, I think that's going to spell trouble for Liga MX, and especially when you consider the issues that Liga MX has been having recently, where they've seemed to have given more preference for foreigners, and they've tried to change some of the rules to give more time and opportunity for younger Mexicans. And so, I think I'm very interested to see with if Pizarro has success and if he's able to make that jump to Europe. And if he doesn't, does MLS now become the go-to place for Mexican players that can't quite make it to Europe, but uh, want to be marketable and want to have more secure incomes and have a better lifestyle? And so once MLS starts taking the best LigaMX players, then I think you're going to start seeing a lot of issues there, a lot of problems for LigaMX.
Yeah, the only I guess argument I would see with that is and Rigo Ayala. I don't know if you probably follow him.
Hmm.
He
Yeah,
uh he reached out to I guess a guy from England, and MLS is shown live apparently. So
yeah, I
that would
saw
be
that.
pretty much late in the evening.
Right.
Um, and that guy seemed to say that there's really not that much viewage or attraction to it as of now. So the whole and I don't know if Martin well he did tweet that the whole
Yeah, I think he tweeted something
springboard.
to the effect that no
Yeah,
one in Europe. Yeah, well, and he I think to your point with what Rigo was talking about, and I followed that conversation, just saying that it is available, but interest or awareness is very low. But
hmm,
I don't think that's the point. I think the fact that it is available is what matters because there's already an existing deal with I think Sky Sports, for example,
yeah,
in England and who else who knows in France or whatever. And so if Buzz starts or if Buzz starts building up for a certain player or certain games, people would automatically say, "Hey, oh, I know where to find that because now it's being promoted on Sky Sports or whatever." As opposed to if there's a big game between America and Monterrey and you're living in England, there's no way for you to find it. You're gonna have to find an illegal stream because Liga MX or the clubs aren't finding a way to structure deals to get distribution beyond the North American continent. And so you're right, and I agree, and I have no argument against that. There's minimal or little interest in poor viewership for MLS abroad, but the structure is already in place in Asia and Europe and in other places where people, if they choose to or if they gain interest, it'll be easier for them to find it as opposed to finding Liga MX, and that's a problem for Liga MX.
yeah,
And so, like I said, for Bizarro, for example, uh, because of the Beckham connection, which I don't I think that's a little bit overblown. I don't think people want to watch a team just because it's owned by someone that they know.
hmm,
I mean, if you think of what is it, Real Oviedo from Spain, that's owned by Carlos Slim. I mean, do Mexicans look to find those clubs to match just because Carlos Slim owns it? I don't really think so. And so
yeah,
I don't know if that's going to have that same effect. That I think if anything, Beckham would use his connections with clubs in Europe maybe to really try to feature Pizarro if that's what he had promised him. But I don't think just the casual fan will just be like, oh, I want to watch Beckham's team, and because Beckham's not playing, he just owns the team. He's a figurehead, and so I think that part has been a little overblown.
yeah. Let Ronaldo buy a team, then he'll be exporting players left and right. As spoken by as a Ronaldo fan over here.
Okay.
So yeah, the so I guess shifting. Okay, so that was the springboard talk. So like shifting to the other thing that Martin was talking about, it seems that the idea of MLS beating Liga MX teams with the quality of these Mexican players going up, which are like higher end, the American-born
Hmm.
player is still going to be, that weaker talent. They're not going to have the depth as a Liga MX team. Do you still see a possibility of MLS teams eventually, like winning CONCAChampions like 3 times in a row, 2 times in a row, and dominating the region that way?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the arguments that I had talked to Martin about was that I think we were both in agreement that um, it's MLS can compete with the top shelf players against Liga MX even more and pay more for them. But the real difference in what's winning the CONCACAF Champions for Liga MX clubs is that the middle of the roster, right? Where those
Yeah,
type of players, that's where that big difference is. And I think you're gonna start to see more success from the MLS side as soon as they, simply put, as soon as they raise their salary cap, as soon as they're able to actually pay uh, more. And not, and what I mean by that is, okay, there is salary cap, and now they start paying those same players more. No, that means that they're going to bring in better players to fill those positions by being able to pay them more, get more people, more players in their prime, get obviously better defending, which has been a huge knock on MLS. And so once you raise the salary cap to a respectable level, I think their salary cap this year is somewhere when you're not including the three DPs, it's around somewhere around 5 million for salary cap. And so when you compare to, this is maybe not a fair comparison. I think the NBA salary cap per team's salary cap right now is like $100 million. But when you think of, okay, what are the salary caps and the highest ones in Liga MX? Um, so I think if you think of, once MLS, for example, say they start to get up in the 60 to $70 million salary cap range, and that includes DPs, um, you're starting to pay for a lot for higher quality players, and you're starting to be maybe on par with the Dutch league and the Portuguese league, or probably better than that. So you're not necessarily a top world league yet. You're not going to compete with EPL or anything like that. But once you start to get to those levels where you have a meaningful salary cap, where you're able to bring in solid players, and you're starting to really develop more players through your academy, that's when you'll start seeing more, you know, MLS teams beating LigaMX clubs in the CONCAChampions League, and actually seeing measurable results, and seeing, that consistency. And so I think that's still a ways off, but I think, if I think LAFC might have a chance this year, uh, and you might have some kind of those one-offs over the next 5 or so years, where you might have an LAFC win, once every few years, or Atlanta United win once every few years. I don't think it's going to necessarily going to be a watershed moment where every single year it's going to be MLS, but I think it's definitely trending that way. But it really, I think the only thing that's stopping MLS teams is MLS themselves, with their just, really unique roster restrictions and mechanisms.
Do you think it's going to require pretty much 11 foreigners on the pitch for MLS? Like no Americans?
Yeah,
Is that
yeah,
what you're saying?
I agree.
Okay.
Yep. Oh yeah, I mean, but yeah, basically, yeah. I mean, either that, or in the long term, when I mean long term, like 10, 15 years, is, when they finally try to hope potentially start seeing fruits from their labors in terms of their academy products. And I mean, and what I mean by that, I think you're going to start to really attract a lot of prospects through those academy ranks, just because of their facilities. I mean, their facilities, the, many of the newer clubs that are building, their academies and their infrastructure are top, world class facilities, that even clubs from across the pond are coming to train at, because they're amazing. And I've been at some of the biggest clubs training facilities in Liga MX, and you go to high school weight rooms that are more luxurious than those for the highest Liga MX club that you can think of. And so, and that's going to be a selling point. Just like when you think of college football, the recruiting battles between SEC schools and Pac-12, and mid-major conferences, it's an arms race. And so these college football programs are investing heavily in their athletic training programs and their training facilities, and that's going to be the same thing with MLS, where if you're an up and coming player and you're like, do I want to train here, or do I want to train in this other facility, even though the club is great, but I'm not going to have the same access to nutritionists and trainers and equipment and state of the art technology. That's going to start being a selling point for these up and coming players.
Yeah, that's a good point. Have you been to Pachuca's facilities?
Not Pachuca's, personally,
Okay.
no.
Yeah, I hear really good things about them. One of the guys on the Cantina podcast, Juan, he had some player. He coaches in LA. He had some players
Okay.
uh, try out, and so he went down to Pachuca, and he fell in love. He's a Chivas fan, but we call him Cambia Rayas because he's
Okay.
he's we joke with him converting to from Chivas to Pachuca, so he's changing his stripes. But yeah, so that is an interesting point on the facilities. I think Pachuca, might be able to compete. But yeah, that's definitely an attraction. One other thing that I was sort of seeing as the attraction when everyone talks about like quality of living and things like that is previously, I guess, the United States is seen as a vacation point. Like you want to go to Miami and check out the beaches, or you want to go to Disneyland in
Hmm.
California, or New York City and all the tourist sites. But now, players can do that and play soccer at the same time. And to me, it seems more like a and me being on the LigaMX and the Mexican side of this whole argument, maybe because of bias or probably because of bias. Uh, it seems more like a fad to me. The whole moving and the whole advantages that are being stated of being going to MLS. I think for Pizarro, his main shot was the Club World Cup, or prior to that was being on the national team. And we know, like from La Volpe, the national team was the only way you were going to get seen by the world. And if Mexico did well at the
Hmm.
confederations within the La Volpe area, they did well, and in the World Cup and everything. And then all these guys like Guardado and Kiki and Borget, all these guys started going to Europe, even though some of them weren't successful. So yeah,
Hmm.
that was just something that I'm sort of noting is
Yeah,
sort
and
of like a
and
cool
and I
aspect
think,
of it.
like I said, sure, and I think one thing to kind of keep in mind too is you think of, obviously we're a little bit older now, but thinking of the 15, 16-year-olds that are growing up, say in Mexico, that are, through because of technology and social media, they're able to follow more closely the trends and what's popular and, what's trending in the US, right? In terms of US culture with music and everything. A 15-year-old maybe probably isn't listening to Tigres del Norte. They're probably listening more to, Mac Miller or someone else that's coming up, right? And um, so I think as they look at that lifestyle in the U.S. and kind of see what's going on over there, if you're a soccer player and you start saying, well, I can live here, and I won't mention Mexican City because I don't want it to be insulting to anyone that's living there, but you know, I can live here and really put my head down and get to work and be successful in soccer, or I can live, in LA, or I can live, in New York and still plug my trade and try to eventually get to Europe and get a nice paycheck and have all these technologies and but also live this American lifestyle and start to live the American dream for myself and send money back to my family if I come from a really tough background economically. And so I think that's something that's probably a consideration to think about that maybe has wasn't something before in the past 20 years ago, but I think nowadays that's definitely going to be a player as a consideration for a player.
Yeah. So I guess to sort of wrap up this whole talk with a final statement or question, one of the arguments that I had, and we sort of in our last episode in the Cantina Mix podcast, we had a sort of some pretty heated discussion uh, on the, I guess, the Molero situation. Like with the national team,
Hmm.
we know
Hmm.
that the Mexican national team is the national team of the United States. They sell out
Hmm.
stadiums. Mexicans go and will pay whatever prices for tickets. And you can compare the prices in the U.S. versus the prices when the national team plays in Mexico, like San Luis or Mexico City.
Hmm.
And then now we're sort of going into the MLS type of things. How many people aren't gonna hold back to go to watch Chicharito play for LA Galaxy? As far as opening up their wallet. Do
Right.
you see that as sort of like I sort of see it as like uh, a negative thing, and I don't see it out there too much. Where like I'm never gonna go and pay for a Morero because they cost. They're
Right.
just some is like the criticism of some, I guess, just ripping off the Mexican and the whole marketing aspect to Chicharito's move and things like that. What are your thoughts on I guess that sort of like money business out of the business of
Yeah.
Mexicans?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely there's definitely a balance, right? And I think it's going to be harder now to I think from a fan standpoint, if you want Mexico to progress and to advance to the Quinto Partido and beyond, you want to play against the best because you're not going to play against the best in the World Cup qualifiers, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
you need the only real option to do that is to either play them in Copa America or to do friendlies and play them in Europe. And it's getting to the point now that national teams from Europe just don't have the time with the scheduling with the UEFA Nations League and everything that's changing now, and now the CONCACAF Nations League. It's going to be so much harder now for those European teams to come to the U.S. Um, and so for Mexico, the best way for them to progress is to play harder competition outside of the World Cup cycles. That's not going to happen, obviously, and so it could be frustrating for fans. From the business standpoint, I mean, you know, it's if you're not maximizing your value from a business standpoint, then you're doing it wrong too. So from the federation standpoint, they recognize that there's a demand for their product in the U.S., where millions and millions of Mexican soccer fans are, and so they're going to get guaranteed checks, corporate sponsorship money, and what are they doing with that money? Then is the question, right? Are they reinvesting that back into their youth programs to raise the level, to raise the rendimiento for the players, um, and you know it's I don't know if I have an opinion as a fan, and I have an opinion from my side of the work as well. And so um, all I have to say is that I think it's going to be harder now more than ever because of all the scheduling changes for anyone to be truly happy with what's going to happen with the Mexican national team. And so and then when you think too with the players, um, with fewer and fewer players both playing in Europe and also succeeding in Europe. So thinking of all the players that are in Europe right now, how many of them aren't starting? Chucky, Tecatito seems to kind of found his niche in Portugal, but it looks like he's probably never gonna, transfer to a bigger club and try to showcase him more. And so if I'm a Mexican soccer fan and looking to 2022, I'm a little worried, especially as opposed to, the lead up to 2014, 2018, where you had a lot of growth and a lot of potential with a lot of players in Europe. Like right now, it's all of our, quote unquote, best players are either going to be playing in MLS or are playing for mid-table teams in Europe, or maybe aren't even starting, and the rest are in Mexico. And so, what is our team really going to look like? It almost feels as though we've gone back to, 1994, where I think I don't even remember. I think it was all basically Mexican-based players, if I'm not mistaken. And then I think a little bit of the same in '98. And obviously, Mexico did decently back then, even though they never got to a quinto partido. But times have changed as well. Every other team has gotten better, in terms of their development and players. And so um, this is kind of, I guess, kind of a long-winded answer, but um, as a Mexican fan, there's definitely frustration in not seeing them play against the best. But from the business standpoint, it makes sense. And for Mexican fans here, like, they're paying up. Attendance hasn't dwindled, ratings haven't dwindled, and so long as there's demand for it, uh, Mexico's going to keep playing in the U.S.
Yeah, I've even like that's been a question for me, is like, giving up some money from the Moleros or from the games in the United States and going out to Europe and investing in those types of things and maybe losing out on the business side. Another thing that we've sort of discussed on the Cantina podcast is players not necessarily needing to go to Europe. Back in the I think I've argued that back in the day when most of the national team was in Mexico, they did just as
Mm-hmm.
well in World Cup tournaments and things like that. So what would be it's sort of like the individual dream, but as a team, as a collective, does it really benefit? So, but
Right.
I guess to the final quick prediction slash question for you as we close out the podcast tomorrow. Who do you have for Leon hosting LAFC? Who do you think is going to win that one?
Um, oh, oh, the series or the game? I think Leon will come away with it tomorrow. And I think probably they end up tying in LA the following week. And so I think Leon ends up advancing. But you know, I don't know. I could see it going both ways too. I mean, if Carlos Vela, I think he's going to be a difference maker. I think if he, takes it serious and really plays as well as he can play, I think that can be a difference maker. And so like I said, I'm really actually interested in seeing how this year's edition will go. This for the CONCACAF Champions League, because uh, if Mexico, or excuse me, if a MLS team advances, or if they end up winning it, it'll be interesting to see kind of the discussions on Twitter. I think there's going to definitely be a lot of overreactions both on the U.S. side and the Mexican side. And
Oh
I
yeah.
know that I know that you love that those fires on Twitter, and so I'm gonna be sitting back and eating my popcorn and enjoying kind of what's gonna be happening. So I don't necessarily have a side that I'm taking. I'm trying to take an objective view because I think I have theories about things that'll happen in the next few years that I've shared with you before, and so this is a good, almost a test case for me, a case study to see if some of these things will happen over the next year or so if certain things happen. So I'm very interested from just a third party non-fan at this point. I'm trying to take off my fan hat to kind of see what's going to happen.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I have my fan hat, but whatever happens, I also have my popcorn out. So that's a non-stop item that I have with me is popcorn. So yeah, like even if MLS were to win and like just humiliate the Liga MX clubs, maybe that'd be a good thing to so that Liga MX would actually think of what they're doing and think of how like all the talk that is out there about MLS surpassing them. So
Well, look, I think this is the at the end of the day, and we may have talked about this on Twitter. I don't remember. The day will come. I think I say in the next 10 years, other people that are very close to the situation between MLS and Liga MX have told me, uh, and on good authority, that's going to happen in 5 years. And what I mean by that is relevancy in North America. Um, and so I really think that MLS will eventually surpass Liga MX. All the check marks are being checked, and it's just trending that way. And like I said, for me, the only thing that's missing is just the on-field product and the results on the pitch. Um, and so once that happens, League MX will just be a relevant domestic league. And so it'll get to the point too where second and third generation Mexican Americans will be almost a hipster league where they just follow like kind of on the back end, which will be a secondary league to them after either their favorite MLS club or a European club. And so one of the other things that I'm really interested in seeing. I think it's going to be very difficult for it to happen, but I know there's definitely a push from both MLS and Liga MX to see if this can happen. Is if they do end up merging either at 2026 or before 2026. I think there's too many. I don't think there's enough time to explain my reasons why I don't think it's going to happen. But if it were to happen, that would be the best thing to happen to Liga MX. And by it not happening, which I don't think it will be kind of the death knell for League MX for the next generation in terms of profitability, in terms of relevance, and you know purchasing power for the league beyond its own borders. And so, long story short, League MX I think desperately needs to hitch onto the MLS wagon and hope for a merger, which would make it a super powerful league. So I'm kind of rooting for it to happen because I think that it could be a really powerful and intriguing league if they were to merge. But I think Liga MX getting to the point where they're going to need MLS more than MLS needs Liga MX. So that's something to look out for over the next few years.
there you have it. That's interesting. Like League MX would be the boomer league. The Pepperidge Farm remembers. The Pepperidge Farm remembers the League MX. That'll be me though, man. I'm okay being called a boomer or whatever, even though I'm not. Well, thanks, Walter. Any last thoughts that you have for us?
uh, no, no, that's it. I appreciate the time and always available for a chat. It's always good to disagree and agree at
Yeah,
the same time.
thanks. Yeah, thanks a lot. And to everyone listening, you can follow Walter on Twitter, the W Franco. Good stuff that he has on the business side of soccer. And thanks a lot for coming on.
Okay, thanks, Beto. Appreciate it.